guys, welcome to the Curios podcast, where we specialize in providing a place for Christians to authentically share their testimony through conversation. My name is Kiersey. I'll be your host today. And today's special guest is a wonderful woman. She is a nurse practitioner. She's been in the world of gynecology and women's health for quite some time. She's a minister. She's a public speaker. She is a very loved member of her community, of her church. I want to introduce you guys to Miss Jessica Brown. How are you, Jessica?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm so excited to be here, and I love the whole premise of this podcast. And really anything that you're doing, I want to be involved in.
Thank you. That means a lot. Fun fact for the people listening, this is attempt number 4 or 5 for the podcast. There has been one thing after another that stopped it, and it's things that you wouldn't even believe. I think like attempt number 7 of us getting together since we met a couple years ago. So I'm really hoping that we get to make up for last time.
Yep, I agree.
Right. Well, let's kick it off, and let's start with the phenomenal icebreaker. What is the most impactful piece of wisdom you've ever received or kept closest to you within your life? Straight into it.
I know you even sent me the questions, and you sent this one to me, and I forgot about it. So I'm going to have to come up with this one. Gosh, I've had so many incredible pieces of wisdom, but I would have to say probably the most impactful piece of wisdom I got was from my own pastor, Radine. Shout out, Radine, if you end up listening to this. But it was something really, really simple. And it was when I was really branching out into discipleship and meeting with women. I was kind of stuck in the cog of, I want to meet with everyone. I want to do everything. I want to be everything to all people. And she simply counseled me that essentially that I needed to stop being perfect and stop being Jesus for everyone. She said, you know what, it's better to disciple 3 people really, really well than 12 people partially. And she said, you know what? Here's my calendar. She showed me her calendar, and she showed me when someone says, hey, can we have coffee? Sometimes she'll say, you know what? I'm free April at 4 p.m. And that was something that was always really hard for me. Like, hey, I need to meet with people right away. Everyone right away. Everyone's need right away. And she taught me kind of the art of discipleship, the art of mentoring well, also protecting your own boundary. And honestly, that's something that I think about almost daily.
Wow. So it's still prioritizing your cup to be filled, but also putting boundaries in place so that you can appropriately fill yours.
Right. And not feeling bad about scheduling in my own time, scheduling in family time. And if you're going to be effective in ministry, you need to be well. And I see a lot of unwell ministers and pastors. And so I'm not trying to do that.
Oh gosh, no, there's truth to that. I kind of took a back seat off of posting stuff because I noticed I was getting not feisty, but short, like hurry sickness, as the ruthless elimination of hurry says. Well, let's jump in then. How did Miss Jessica grow up? What was your background? How did you get led to the Lord? What did childhood look like?
So I was one of the very fortunate humans to be born into a Christian family. The mom and dad, who were both believers at the time, but my mom and dad were both very new believers, and they both came from broken homes themselves. And so they both had prior marriages, and they both had prior children in kind of those broken homes. And then kind of around the same time, my mom and dad both gave their life over to Christ. And then they ended up moving to Coeur d'Alene and extending their family. So I have one biological sister from my mother and father, and then I have amazing siblings that come from my parents' prior relationships. So there was a lot of Bible reading, there was a lot of health, but there was also a lot of things from the past that really kind of came to the surface as my sister and I got older, and we kind of realized, like, we're the other family. Like just so many things that we didn't realize because my parents did such an incredible job of protecting us and creating a really safe haven for us. And so I grew up knowing the Lord. I don't have a conversion story. I don't have any date. I don't have any discernible time. When I look back, people are like, "Well, when did you become a Christian?" I'm like, "I have no idea."
That's a
I
good.
and right, and I think that it's kind of one of those testimonies that people, of course, want for their kids. Of course, there were times when I wasn't following the Lord and I had kind of walked away, but I never left the Lord and I never rejected the Lord. I've known him from very, 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 very young. And so I have grown up with the Lord and in the Lord.
That's amazing. I've actually met quite a few friends that have a similar testimony as they grew up in the
Mhm.
comfort and the safety of their Lord.
Mhm.
And they almost look down on that. And so when you said, like,
Yeah.
when you introduced that, I was like, yes, it's such like, as a mother, you do crave that. But I think the question that I often ask is, what did your searching period and your rebellion period look like to cement your faith? And so for you, you mentioned you did kind of have a little bit of a phase, but
Mhm.
what was that phase like for you, and coming to know like this is what you believe versus this is what you
Yeah.
were.
Well, first I'll go back a little bit. I was a very mentally unstable child. And
Okay.
so despite the upbringing that I had, I probably inherited a lot of generational things. And when I think probably between 11 and 12, maybe 7th, 8th grade, I developed absolutely crippling anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder. And people say all the time, like, oh, I have OCD because I like to keep things clean. And that's, of course, that's not true OCD. And so I had true OCD and a
Okay.
little bit of Tourette's when I was younger. And so I had a lot of tics, severe anxiety, and I actually developed a really severe hair pulling disorder called trichotillomania.
Wow.
And yeah, people are always like, "Wait, what?"
Yeah.
You could ask anyone who knew me when I was 12, but I was riddled with anxiety. I mean, there were times where I had pulled out all my hair, and you can imagine for a 7th, 8th grader in those super formative molding years to be suffering with an anxiety and an obsessive compulsive that so everyone can see. And so it was one of those like, oh, when I'm not doing well, everyone knows because I'll pull my hair out and everyone can see it. And so of course I was the source of ridicule. Mental health was really stigmatized back then, which that would have been in the 90s when I was in junior high, 1997, 8, somewhere around there. And so, of course, it was a really painful few years for me, wondering what was wrong with me and why I was broken and why I couldn't stop. And oh my gosh, I'm sorry. This is
I
so
was wondering if you were going to come in, your dogs.
they were not supposed to, but it has happened. I heard
It's
little
okay.
paws.
I heard him too, and then I saw you look down. I was like, they're coming in.
Oh my god.
They can join. That's okay.
Uh,
So what was the bridge from being in the midst of that, and then like what happened after?
so essentially, I was walking through a lot of trauma just in my own spirit. And I had people there for me. I had family who knew the Lord. I mean, I remember my aunt taking me to the healing rooms, and it was in those moments where I was so distraught and so broken. Um, you know, I never became suicidal
Mm.
ever, which is something that isn't really common anymore, but I was so low that I remember feeling like, "Is this my life? Am I just gonna live like this? Is this who I am? Am I just a not functional person?" It was in those moments that I encountered the Lord in a way that was, um, otherworldly,
Yeah.
and to this day, I look back and I'm like, I've never encountered the Lord like I did when I was 12 and 13. Because when I was 12 and 13, I needed that to stay alive. But now, as a grown adult who's 37, turning 38, I look back and I think, I know the goodness of the Lord because I
Mm.
remember the times where He showed up to me when I was at my lowest point as a teen.
Wow.
And so Yeah, I would
That's
say it's like I already knew the Lord. I knew of the Lord. I knew the goodness of the Lord, but I really felt the Lord for myself when I really hated my life. And there were
yeah,
times that, I just was like, life's not even worth living. Although I was not suicidal, I didn't have a plan. I remember feeling that, weeping in my bedroom. Nobody understands. I remember people just being like, just stop. Like,
yeah,
just stop pulling your hair out. Like, as if I wanted to do that as a 12-year-old girl, you know?
yeah,
It's like telling someone with an eating disorder, "Well, just eat." Like, "Oh, I didn't
yeah.
think of that."
Why not? Oh
Right,
man. So
right.
there's two things that come to mind. So I have a question about getting delivered from the despair, and
Mhm,
then the just more of a comment is the Lord brought something to me a couple weeks ago, and it was I feel like before God does anything with any Christian or puts them in a public setting, they have
mhm.
to learn to rest in the valley. And that's almost what I'm envisioning with you is you're in the moment
Mhm.
of this valley that feels like there's no end. Being able to rest in the Lord's love and see him there with you in the midst of that is
Yeah.
I think beautiful that a lot of people overlooks. And
Mhm.
so you still are living off of that manna almost because of how crucial it was to you.
Yeah, and
Oh,
and it the empathy that it develops within you. I mean, people tell me
yeah.
all the time, like, "Well, this isn't really something I talk about," or, "This is kind of embarrassing. It's really weird." And I'm like,
Do you know?
I am the safest of people for you to tell me all of your weird to, because I have gone through some of the weirdest forms of
Mhm.
OCD, the weirdest forms of mental illness, the ones that everyone can see and are very strange and unusual. I have felt so weird my whole life. And I think that's what equipped me to be a really effective empathy for people who were going through some of their strangest times or they couldn't explain it or, any degree of mental illness. I'm like, bring it to me because
Let's talk.
I have 0 ounce of judgment.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's literally, I think, like beauty from ashes.
Mhm.
That's
Yep,
amazing. Okay, so
yep.
what did the deliverance from the despair look like? How did you guys transfer out of that between you and God?
For me, it was years. It was years and
Yeah.
years and years.
Patience.
And yep, and because I continued to struggle with these disorders throughout high school. I wasn't delivered in a moment. I always wanted that, like, miraculous, "I was healed." It never was that for me. I walked it out, and I got better and better as the years went by, and then I would kind of regress when things got bad or stressful. I mean, I won't even to this day, anxiety is not something that's a stranger to me,
Yeah.
but I no longer struggle with obsessive compulsive disorder or despair. I think
Yeah.
slowly lifted over the years as I gained clarity with Lord, really him teaching me that these things were not a punishment. I was not a broken human. I wasn't broken. That the Lord was actually allowing me to experience these things so that I could go on and talk about them and encourage people who are still stuck in that moment.
Wow. Um, I think it takes a very strong spirit and a very bold spirit to be able to consistently look to God. Um, in the midst of just it's not a constant, it's not an
Mhm.
immediate thing. So what did those prayer conversations look like for you, or just those quiet place moments look like for you in the moments of frustration of not having that instant deliverance? And if you could go back and talk to young Jessica as you are right now, what encouragement would you tell yourself as you're being patient waiting through the breakthrough through all of those years?
Um, gosh, like some of those prayers looked like prostrate. Um, some of them looked like weeping, wailing, anger,
Mm,
every degree of emotion that you can possibly imagine is what my prayers have looked like over the years, and sometimes what they still look like. But what I can turn around and tell my younger self, gosh, I wish I wish that were a thing, because 'cause I'd be such a good encourager to myself then. Because I just
yeah.
remember feeling like this is hopeless, and I'm always going to have shame for this weird disorder that I struggle with. And I wish that I could turn around and tell myself that the shame 100% lifts, and that it really does become a testimony. I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I can't get married because this person's going to find out that I struggle with these things. And I look back and I think, what a silly, immature thing to say, but really feeling genuinely like I had to hide myself. And
Yeah.
now being like, you know what? I can put my mess on air and be totally fine.
That's
I
a beauty.
I can talk about these things. They're no longer private. And my goal now is to reach others who are in the midst of their mental health struggles or the weird disorders that people are going through, especially the younger population who feels like they can't talk about it, or that group of women. I'm like, that's where my heart is, to look back as a 37-year-old and be like, hey, it gets better. It's going to be okay. The Lord will walk you through it. And
Yeah.
this isn't your destiny. This isn't your life to feel like you have to hide yourself.
Oh my gosh, our generation is
Mhm.
so enslaved to social media in some aspects, and that
Mhm.
is a huge part of social media. So
Right.
getting to see how God shaped that clay
Mhm.
is that's wonderful, especially knowing where you're going. Like that's
Yeah.
wonderful.
And with it, like, I haven't even talked about this until now. I haven't really talked about it publicly until now.
I'm honored. I'm so honored. Like
That's okay.
literally,
I
I
hate it. I
love
just
that
haven't really had, like, the platform
opportunity.
to really go into any of the stuff that I struggled with when I was
Yeah.
younger.
So remembering it gets better. Was there any
Mhm.
scripture that you clung to or any books of the Bible you clung to through that time?
Yep. Yep. And so the biggest thing that I clung to, was that the Lord had good plans for me to prosper me, and that
8:29,
Mhm.
Jeremiah 29:11.
Jeremiah, and that was literally, I clung to it even when I didn't believe it. I really didn't believe it when
Mm,
I was younger. I just thought, how could he allow me to be afflicted with these things and still have good plans for me? But I hung on to it because I had felt his goodness in
mm,
certain moments. And so I knew, okay, the Lord has good plans for me to prosper me and not harm me. Okay, he has plans to not harm me. I remember, like, over and over and over, even though I'm bringing harm to myself and harm is happening to me, his plans for me are to prosper me and not to harm me. And I just remember
that's
that,
so
like,
good.
over and over and over.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I heard from a woman the other day. I asked her how she got through a rough patch, and she's like, I just remember sitting there and saying, do not diminish in the dark what God has called in the light.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I'm hearing you like, that's my testimony. And the
Yeah.
fact that you said that, I'm like, I get to see it lived out. That's so
Yep.
cool.
Yeah.
Oh man. There's okay, so let's fast forward. So you went through that time of patience. What
Mhm.
did meeting your husband look like? And then getting into the medical field look like? Kind of what did that,
Mhm.
how did your background turn into your
Yeah.
career, I guess?
So the kind of quicker version is that my mom is an RN, my dad's an RN, my sister's an RN, and then my mom went on to become a nurse practitioner. And so it was kind of like, this is what we do in our family. It was very natural. Our
Wow.
dinner conversations were always medical. I had learned a lot about the medical field before even stepping into it. And so
Right.
I took the natural path and I really liked it. And I was good at it. I had a knack for it. I had very academically inclined brain. And so school always came very easy to me. I met Craig when I was already in it. And so when he met me, he already knew, like, hey, this is the path that I'm taking. And he was bound for ministry, and I was on a path to medical field, and we intersected.
And you guys just kept going because I
Mhm.
remember coming to a Bible study at your guys' house, and you had like just gotten out of a surgery or just off of work. You went on a quick run, and you like plopped down on the couch, and you're like, "I'm here, let's go." And he's been leading this Bible study. And I remember finding like so much inspiration in it as a wife is like they are both totally on opposite realms, but they're both healers in their own way, yet they're so
Yeah.
unified. And so,
Mhm.
how did you guys maintain that unity in a very rapidly growing ministry as well as a
Mhm.
career with kids?
So, honest answer, we didn't very well for a while. There
I
was
like
a lot of friction. because Craig really wanted me side by side with him in ministry. He wanted me as that ministry wife, and I was so busy. Like, if anyone's ever gone to this type of school, you know that it's pretty relentless. I just didn't have the capacity to do both. We basically butted heads. And it really, really tore on our marriage probably for the first couple of years until we realized that what I was doing was ministry, but it wasn't going to look like how Craig envisioned, and that it was also okay. And so we came to a really healthy place. It was a battle of years. I was never the pastor's wife. I wasn't the typical, I was going to be there. And a lot of times I wasn't even there because I was working or studying or doing my own thing. And so we had to navigate what that looked like. And it wasn't always healthy, to be honest. And then I got pregnant right away. And then I had a baby. And then I was in school and had a baby. And Craig wanted me around. And I was basically crumbling. And so, yeah, we sought counsel. I mean, we did it all. And then we over the years, same thing. Nothing was ever really fixed easy for us. It took a couple of years of fight for us to come to the healthy place of me having my ministry in the medical field and then Craig having his ministry. And us intersecting, but not being, we weren't necessarily always running together in the same ministry.
Man, okay, so I know this is a question, I didn't write this to you, but it came up. How did you guys choose to navigate that conflict in front of your children? Because I know some parents are like, avoid conflict at all times. And Colton and I are like, no, they should see conflict. Like, there's a point of the conflict they shouldn't see, but there's sometimes it still comes out and you're like, oh, you guys probably shouldn't have seen that. So did you guys ever have conversations around that?
We never really had the heat of our arguments in front of the kids, but they were definitely probably privy to it. Now honestly, it's almost a little hard for me to remember because it was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
We've never really been the ones who become loud or really yell, but we have lots of conversations, and we have the conversations in front of our kids. Even now, we have lots of conversations in front of our kids, but we have them in a healthy way. Even when they're conflictual conversations and we're working things out, our kids are privy to it all the time.
I think of like the trending Instagram reels where it's like when you're mad, but you still love each other, and they're like dramatically handing the baby diaper or like dramatically making the bed, but still helping. Like, that's kind of how I picture you guys. It's like, here's your food.
Right. And then we're like, I love you. We kiss each other, and then we walk away.
We'll figure this out.
Right. Because the truth is, their kids are obviously going to come into conflict, and they need to know what it looks like for healthy people to have conflict and resolve conflict. And if you pretend like it doesn't exist, your kids are going to feel like something's wrong with them when their own conflict comes up and they don't know how to handle it.
Yeah.
But we weren't screaming. We weren't throwing things.
Yeah. But it was something I was like, how did you guys? Because I feel like that would have been a heated time in general when you're like,
it was. But like, I think a lot of the times JC was really young. She was like a baby. So like some of the times I don't really know.
Yep. No, well, and there's all things that comes with a newlyweds and new family, and then you add that, and we've got a 2-year-old in a couple days and a 3-year-old. So I get it.
Those are hard times. Hard times.
I love it. Oh, I like want more babies, but I don't want to be pregnant again for others.
But that is also one of my testimonies.
So let's talk about that then. Tell me a little bit about your baby journey and how you ended up as an OB delivering babies.
So I was really sick when I was pregnant, really, really sick. And I was actually already working in the OB/GYN field at the time when I got pregnant, and I had hyperemesis. And so that's basically the disorder where you're vomiting so much that you're losing weight and you're producing ketones. And essentially, I lost a lot of weight, got really sick, had lots of IV fluids, lots of hospital visits.
With both babies?
And so it really took a psychological toll on me, probably more than physical. it became psychological for me, like, "Oh, you're gonna be sick and throw up everything again tomorrow and the next day and for the next several months," and so we pretty much knew, yeah, but same thing, it was one of those things that my empathy again became very high for people who were struggling with pregnancy ailments and struggling with menstrual and reproductive ailments. It was almost like God was like, "Okay, so you're gonna experience a lot of these own issues yourself, hormonal issues, period issues, migraine issues, hyperemesis. So that way, when I put you on the field to take care of these women, you're going to know what they're going through. And there's going to be a degree of empathy that maybe wouldn't have been there if you hadn't experienced what it's actually like
Mm,
to be the
wow.
patient." And so I kind of always knew I wanted to go into OB-GYN. I loved it from the very start. I
Mhm.
never wanted to take care of like a 90-year-old male with pneumonia. That just wasn't my cup of tea. In because really that's mainly I didn't really do a lot of obstetrics, really mostly gynecology. And for me, when it comes to feminine health, you get to know a woman on such a personal level as
Yeah.
compared with someone with pneumonia. Taking care of people who are going through sexually transmitted infections. They're going through divorces. They're going through husbands who've cheated and then given them herpes. They're going through certain things that give you insight into their life and an open door into the soul of a woman versus when someone comes in with an earache, it's kind of like, okay, cool, treat the earache out the door. Whereas
Yeah.
when someone comes in and they've been given a disease from a broken marriage, there's it's so much more emotionally charged because it has to
Yeah.
do with very personal, intimate aspects of their life, and so, of course, this field was always a draw for me because I wanted to know women, and I wanted to help women in those deeper areas of emotional health because it was stuff that I experienced.
Wow.
And so, yeah,
That
I knew right away. I'm like, "This is the way." I became a gynecology NP. I couldn't even practice anything else. That was it. I knew. I'm like, board
wow.
certification was OB-GYN. That was it. That's all I wanted.
Well, and going back to your teenage years too, like you have to have a strong sense of empathy and almost have to have
Mhm,
gone through something weird. My One of my mentors says
mhm.
weird is wealthy, but it made you wealthy in the spirit. Like, because I've thought about what goes through gynecology, but I haven't thought about it on the level of you. It is opening up to a woman's soul and a
Mhm,
capacity, and getting pap smears and stuff is like
mhm.
the worst. And so
Right.
you're
It's
like having
very
someone that's
intimate.
gentle and yeah.
Right,
Um,
right.
so you've one of the questions I wrote down or wanted to ask is you've probably seen some supernatural things
Mhm,
in just your ministry and practice in general. Do you want to talk about some of those? That well, which you can
mhm.
under law.
Yeah. I one of the things that I really wanted to share was I did a lot with infertility.
Okay.
Yeah, another a really emotionally charged situation for women and for men. And w some of the coolest things I saw, one in particular that I wanted to share, was and I won't say anything that's, um
Violating HIPAA.
right, I'm not gonna violate a law or anything,
Yeah.
but there was several couples that, I encountered, that were on their fertility journey. Some of them who'd gone through years of infertility, years. They've done
Mm,
Clomid, every fertility drug on the planet. They've tested their ovulation for years. I mean, you name it, all of the things, before going to IVF and beyond. So there were several couples that I got to encounter who were believers. And one couple in particular that really stood out to me who'd gone through several years of infertility, and they came in for an insemination, and that is essentially when you inseminate someone, you are helping them ovulate with a medication. You can do it without, but most of the time we were adding Clomid or letrozole to the mix to help the release of an egg, and then you're basically, like, siphoning off the liquid portion of semen, so it's just sperm, really concentrated. And then you take that, and with a little device, you go past the cervix, and then you release it up at the very top of the uterus. And so you're bypassing the cervix. To be honest, it's not a super effective fertility treatment statistically. It's kind of like, okay, well, this will add a few percent, this will add a few percent. But it's a first line fertility treatment before going to IVF. And a lot of couples aren't comfortable with IVF. They're not going to go that far. And so I vividly remember sitting in the room with this couple, praying over them. I'm like, hey, you know what? Like we're going to give this to the Lord. And I just remember encountering the Holy Spirit in that room. We were all crying. We haven't even done anything. And I'm like, we have to hurry up, like this specimen, like, let's go. And I just remember laying hands on them and all of us crying, and just the presence of God being there in that room in this moment. And this is a painful procedure. It's an awkward procedure. It's emotionally charged. And so anyways, we do the procedure, and she gets pregnant, conceives, and gives birth.
Did you get to deliver baby?
No, I assisted a lot of C-sections, and I still do, but none of the vaginal deliveries, I gave that over. And so a couple years later, I was with Craig, and we ran into this couple out to eat, and they were like, this is her. Getting to like see the fruits of that. And very rarely in fertility interventions do you have a one and done. That is just, there's usually a lot of intervention. There's a lot of different, things. And it was just one of those moments where I was like, man, that's so cool that God showed up in that moment. We prayed over it, and I was like, supernaturally. And after years and years and years and years of trying, one insemination, done, pregnant. And so that happened more times than I can count, to where I was so excited to do fertility, because man, I am praying and interceding for these women even when they don't know it. And
oh my gosh, that's amazing.
To see the culmination of that was, just absolutely beautiful. And some of it was, I was like pulling my statistics for IUI, and I was like, statistically, there should be a lot more conceptions than there was. Yeah. Based on how successful it is, and based on the history of the women that I was seeing. I'm like, so cool.
So you had more conceptions, and statistically you should have.
Yeah.
Wow.
At least in a period of time. There was like a 6-month period where I was like, what is happening? Yeah, I was like, this is so cool. I saw so many conceptions with this that it was such a beautiful time.
Man, that's amazing, because I've heard a lot of, I know a little bit about IVF, but I've heard there's a lot of gunk around IVF. And
yeah, IVF is a little different ballgame. IUI is more like,
and that's prior to IVF.
There's no embryo. Okay. There's no egg retrieval. There's no basically like creating something outside of the body.
Gotcha.
It's very much just like, here's the semen, and instead of sex, you're basically taking it, getting rid of the liquid, taking the most concentrated sperm, and putting that sperm in the uterus during ovulation.
That makes sense.
Right.
That makes sense. Okay. So then my question was, from your professional stance, I have lots of friends. Well, one specifically that comes to mind that I've been praying with. She is in her 30s. She's wanted a baby so much. And she's at that point, she's surrendered and she's given up because every form of treatment hasn't worked. Yeah. For women that are navigating that or are seeing that, or women you saw, I know counsel is going to be very much contextual, but what is a verse or an encouragement that you have often found helps navigate that discouragement for women?
One of the things that I have found comes from Job. And when Job was in his dark night of the soul, and his friends were not comforting, and they didn't provide appropriate comfort, a lot of the times, what I have found that women really need is someone to listen and be okay that someone's angry and sad. And letting someone vent their emotions without immediately turning around and being
offering a fix.
And because I see a lot of women who are in the acute trauma phase of that, where they've just lost another baby, they've just had another failure of IVF or whatever it might be. And sometimes just being there and being like, hey, God is with you. He will never leave you and he will never forsake you. And this sucks. And this is sad. And I don't know why. And I don't know why it happens to some women and not to others. And sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not. But God is with you and he will never leave you and he will never forsake you. And I'm here and I'm going to cry with you. And we're going to admit that it does suck, but that you're not alone. So a lot of the verses that I give to women are about the presence of God, being with the brokenhearted from the Psalms, where the psalmists are, whatever psalm it is, they're bearing their heart and they're bearing their grievances. It's really, really, really hard for women who've just lost a baby or who aren't able to conceive, and someone comes with a joyous word. There's a verse about that. Oh, I can't remember what it is at the moment.
We'll put it on the screen in post.
Yeah, I'm like, there's a verse about that where sometimes it's a proverb. It's like a cheerful word in a time of despair is like blankety blank, along those lines. And so I know it's hard because you're like, well, what is the encouragement? The encouragement is that God's with you even when,
and that it may suck.
Yeah. And people don't get healed and people's babies die and people lose their life and moms die of cancer with little kids. It's hard to provide the right encouragement in those scenarios other than being present, supporting them and letting them know that they're not alone.
That's beautiful. I have a friend down here. She specializes in providing trinkets for women that have gone through child loss. So whether it's miscarriage or stillborns. And it was, like shameless plug. It's called My July 27, but it's based off of a child that she lost. And it's become a ministry and counseling. And I remember going to her and I actually had a miscarriage and I had gone to her like to get counsel for another friend who went through a pretty awful situation. And she's like, really just instead of just, because I was like, how do you counsel that? Like, do you just not say anything and say like, oh, sorry, I wasn't there during the hard time? Or do you show up, or what does that look like? And she's like, instead of saying, let me know if I can help you, I'm coming to give you food. What time? Like making sure you're direct and letting them be angry. And so there's I remember asking her about her journey and she was like, I was just told to like feel my emotions and they're acceptable. And so I find that really encouraging that you found that on full like medical perspective, but also on like, leader in ministry. I was going to ask you, so in your practice, there's a lot more than just babies and fertility. There's the other side of women that have came in that may have been being sold or trafficked or choosing to be in that industry. And I've heard horror stories from women in that general. They're like, I can't even see a gynecologist because of my industry, where I feel like you probably took a compassionate stance because you saw all the things. And one of the questions I asked is like, you and Craig did a rad talk a couple of years ago called Let's Talk About Sex Baby. And you talked about it from like a medical and a ministry perspective. And so I really just kind of want to use that to segue into that is what, and then you're wearing a shirt that says people are not property. So I have a feeling that you're a little passionate about the trafficking topic. And so let's dive into that.
So yeah, I mean, throughout the course of the decade, I saw sex workers, women who were abused, women who were in sex work that had not chosen that, who had fallen into it, and women who had chosen it. But I would say more often than not, I saw women who had undergone some of the most hideous forms of sexual abuse. And ironically, those women are the ones who need gynecologic care the most, and they are the women who have the hardest time letting someone else examine them for obvious reasons. And that was probably my biggest passion point, was seeing women who had undergone horrific abuse and they needed to be examined. or they needed help with something, but they weren't able to see a man, or they had a bad experience elsewhere. Those were the women that I wanted to see.
Mm.
Those were the women that pulled on my heart the most. Because I mean, if anyone's had a pap smear, it's uncomfortable to put your legs in stirrups and let someone look at your very innermost bits. It just is the nature of it. But if you have been molested, if you have been taken advantage of, if you have been hurt in that way, especially from someone who's in authority and who is in a power position or who's in charge or whatever, it's exceptionally hard to come to someone who, says they're in charge and says that they have good intentions and allow yourself to be vulnerable to them. And so, one of the most incredible things that I really feel that the Lord allowed me to be as a conduit for those women to compassionately encounter them. And a lot of times we talked 5 times before we did an exam. A lot of times I would say, "Hey, I'm scheduling 45 minutes for this 30-second pap smear because there's going to be not 1 second of rush, there's going to be not 1 second of pain." And um, having the ability and the desire to do that for these women, or rape care, women who've been assaulted recently and who needed exams. Most of the time they'll be seen at the hospital for that, but occasionally they would come and see me because they had known me and we had a relationship. And the way that God works through those scenarios is absolutely incredible. Like, I
Oh my
just feel
gosh.
such an honor that I got to be that person, a safe person for those women.
So I kind of like a medical question about that, your
Mhm,
experience in that, and I have a ministry question. A ministry question is, I think, oftentimes in that world, um, or when you're walking with people that are navigating that stuff, they feel
mhm,
like, "Oh, you're Christian, you're going to judge me," or "I don't want your preaching." And so, how did you love them without enabling them,
mhm,
or without encouraging it, from a faith-based perspective?
mhm,
And then, I guess the medical question I have is, I listened to a doctor's TED talk, and she had said she had seen clients that were in the midst of being trafficked and had pimps in the room and had no idea because she just wasn't alerted to the
mhm.
signs to how to help women in general. And so,
Yeah.
while you were practicing, like, was it something that was commonly talked about? Was there things put in place and regulations put in place to help these women get out of it? Like, did they
Mhm.
often want to get out of it? And then the ministry side, of course.
Yeah, yeah. I had quite a few sex workers that were they weren't trying to get out of it. They would kind of, like, come in for almost like routine STD checks. And, of course, like, it's so ironic that they would come and see someone like me, um, because a lot of times they have no idea what my spiritual background is, or that I was, like, a
Yeah.
virgin until I got married or anything like that. But my tactic was to love them relentlessly and ask a lot of questions. And so
Nice.
what I noticed when I'm looking through the Gospels is that Jesus asked a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And I let women work it out on their own, because sometimes, of course, if you come at them with a bat, they're gonna run away and never come back. And so I would ask a lot of women, "Well, how do you think that this is adding to your life?" Or
Mm.
what are the ways that you feel like you're trapped in this? Or what makes you feel like this is your only option? Or what made you choose this? And how are you feeling emotionally since you've started working in the sex industry? Has it increased your mental health, or has it decreased your mental health?
Yeah.
And what you'll find is that, of course, the answers come thereafter. Or, women will say, "Well, my mental health's fine." And I'm like, "Okay, you're on 25 different psychiatric medications," or, and so,
It's the high.
a lot of questions, to these women. And same goes for a 16-year-old who comes in and has had 20 partners. I'm going to ask the same questions. How do you think that this is benefiting you? To, how is this has this increased your self-esteem, or has this decreased your self-esteem having these partners? Or how do you think that this is helping you in your relationships? Or things like that don't necessarily come across as judgmental, but they open up a dialogue where you can have a conversation, but in a loving way. And I think when you're really loving someone and you're really, really, really putting on the lens of love, the Holy Spirit speaks through you. And he'll
Yeah.
say things to that exact woman that exact woman needs to hear in that moment. And so I wouldn't necessarily say the same thing to everyone. I might have a tougher love with one woman and have a very empathetic, I'm here for you love for another woman.
That's
But
amazing.
yeah, in the sex industry, lots and lots of questions, lots and lots
Mm.
of love.
Yeah. And I think that kind of answers both questions in its own. Where do you feel like the medical industry is failing in the sex industry in general, or approaching it? And how could they improve? Because I feel like you might have had a conversation about that.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is that medical workers, like you said, aren't necessarily aware of the signs of trafficking, and or they think it's not happening in their region, and so they're not on the lookout for those signs. How to recognize a pimp, how to recognize a domestic abuse situation. So oftentimes these women will, statistically, they'll be seen in the medical system like 5 or 6 times and no one will recognize that they're trafficked. And so those are the things that require education, because there are signs. There are signs. Sometimes they're a little more out in the open, and other times they're more covert. But if you really are looking for them, you're going to find them a lot more often. And so we're failing women when they walk in the door. We treat them for an STD. They walk out the door. We never ask a question. We don't know anything about them. You don't know they're
Mhm.
trafficked. You don't know that
Mhm.
you have no idea. And then the other way is that we're encouraging positivity for the sex industry workers. And so there's a huge wave of, how do we support these women? How do we love them and not judge them? And of course, I'm not saying judge them and don't love them, but that doesn't mean that we should affirm a woman's choice to be a sex worker. That's not the best design for anyone if you're a believer or a non-believer.
Yeah.
Physically, mentally, emotionally, we know that sex workers have higher rates of mental illness, higher rates of suicide. They're more prone, your rates of being murdered are crazy high compared to the general
Mhm.
public. And it's not a good industry. And so a lot of people are failing in that manner, that it's like, "Oh, good for you. You're in the sex industry. Let's keep you safe." But that's it.
Mhm.
That's
No,
it.
and I so agree. There's like, so two things at the arcade. We have a lot of younger girls that come in, and
Mhm.
I've been promiscuous. Well, no, I'm not anymore. Like, let me take that back. I was when I was 14, as I lost my virginity then, and I had quite a few partners in my teenage years, and I did get into camming and I did get into that stuff. And I look at these girls and I'm like, I see you on that track, and I like OnlyFans. They're like, oh,
Yeah.
that bad Barbie girl or whatever her name, she made $10 million in one day, and this teacher left to make $1 million, but nobody's
Right.
talking about the 10 years of healing that it's going to
Consequences.
take for the month
Mhm.
of production that you put out, or
Right.
whatnot. And so one of the things you talked about in Let's Talk About Sex Baby
Mhm.
was going for the root is, and how it's being
Mhm.
encouraged, and how you often saw that it was porn in general. And so
Mhm.
I kind of want to put you on a hot seat, and can you
Yeah.
go down that path from your observations?
Oh, I mean, honestly, there's always a root, right? Where does it start? People don't just wake up at 12 years old and decide that they're going to become a sex worker. And men don't just wake up and decide that they're going to be a womanizer and addicted to, this, that, or the other thing. And so, of course, we have to look at the roots, and the roots is pornography. It's plain, it's simple. The statistics don't lie, that when you introduce yourself and your mind and your brain and your spirit to pornography, that there is a predictable trend of where you will end up. And I mean, anyone who watches porn regularly will tell you that it gets a little more hardcore, a little more hardcore, a little more hardcore, and the girls get younger and younger, because our brain chemistry, that's how we're designed. And so if we continually take drugs at a certain milligram, you will continually require more and more and more to get the same high, because of course we become immune to the effects of it. And the same thing happens with your brain chemistry in pornography. And so, of course, the sexualization of men and women, we never saw anything like this before the advent of pornography. And so, with the accessibility of it, with the booming industry that pornography is, of course we have sex trafficking. Of course we have sex industry workers exploding in numbers. Of course we do, because we're allowing the human population basically unregulated access to hideous pornography and very hardcore and very violent pornographic situations that will change your brain chemistry to desire that and to
Wow.
actually need that for sexual gratification.
Yeah. Have you seen it? So I've seen case studies or stories of kids getting younger and younger, of like some pretty, like, I think the worst one I heard was there was a 13-year-old boy. He attacked a college age girl and beat her so badly and raped her because that her phone couldn't recognize her facial recognition, and he had a porn addiction. I mean, so have you seen the youth porn addictions decrease, or the age decrease? And then what have you seen parent in that community talking about for parents to address their kids about it, but also protect them in that?
Porn is getting seen younger, accessed younger, and addictions are starting much earlier. And so we're seeing like 7, 8, 9. And the problem is that we have, again, unregulated access to devices. And so you have a 9-year-old boy alone in his room on a phone. What do you think he's going to encounter? And if he does encounter it and he doesn't know what to do with it, then it's going to go down that slippery slope. And so as parents, if you're not aware, then you need to be made aware that this is a problem. And if you are aware, then you need to intervene and know that it's not just laughing. It's not just, oh, ha, 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 ha. I mean, I've heard this time and time again. Oh, well, I know that I mean, I've heard moms sitting with their kids like, well, I know that she started watching porn at 12 and, her dad, blah, blah, blah. And there's this like very casual nature about it. And so until we understand the catastrophe that is what happens to your brain chemistry on porn, then we'll continue to treat it like a normal thing. I mean, like, even like when a Friends episode, it's just like normalized that that's what we do is we watch porn and it's ha ha ha. We just laugh about it. It's
Oh
totally
my
normal.
gosh. There's a whole conversation around that. Like, I grew up going to friends' houses and it was just playing on the TV, and it's not that, it's your soul. Like, you are soul tying with somebody. You're opening yourself up to STDs, but there's a spiritual side of it. Like, I got demons transferred during sex, like, that I had to be delivered from. Like, there's things that people don't talk about. And that's a whole story. So there's people that I have in mind that I've talked to a little bit, like, kind of saying, oh, like, I heard this like sermon and she was saying this, and like, have you looked at it with your kids? And they're like, oh, my kids wouldn't do that. There's the parents that are almost in the blind because they don't know how to initiate the conversation. How would you counsel a parent to initiate the conversation, or what resources would you turn them on to? Because I feel like once a teenager's like 15, 16 and they're like, leave me alone, and there hasn't been boundaries, it's even harder to have that relational conversation. So I guess, what have you seen in that?
So I think what parents need to do is have very clear conversations very early on. And it's uncomfortably early. Now, if you haven't talked to your kids about sex by 9, they will have learned about it at school. And so it is grotesque and so viscerally uncomfortable to talk to your little kids about sex. But unfortunately, we live in this world where we absolutely have to. You do it in a very clear way, a very direct way, and a very age-appropriate way. Of course, I'm not talking to a 6-year-old about hardcore pornography. However, we're talking about internet safety. We're talking about, what do you do when you encounter someone who's naked on a screen? What do you do in that scenario if you see someone who's naked on a screen? With my kids, we just enabled an app called ours is it's called our Pact, and it's a safety app. And so it's on every single one of our devices, but also our devices are very out in the open. There's no computers in rooms behind shut doors. Like, it's the little things. Are you charging your phone at night in your room, or are you charging your phones in the living room? Are you
Yeah.
just obliterate the ability for there to be an accident, because no one it's not about your kids not they wouldn't do that. It's of course they wouldn't do that intentionally.
Oh my gosh. No, it's right. We just watched the Netflix movie that came out with Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen. Jennifer Lawrence, right? That's her name.
Oh,
She was full blown, like, came out
Uh-huh.
of the ocean
Yep,
completely
I saw
naked.
that.
And when she was sitting with the parents, they're like, well, we looked at his porn history. And Colton and I are like, what are we watching? Like, this
I
is.
watched that too, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, she's butt naked. She's fully naked."
I was like, oh, this.
There are
We Googled it. I was like, was that her? Was that a computer?
top and bottom. I know. Same thing, and I was like, "Oh, cool," watching a movie by myself, and I'm like,
But if the kids were in the room, or like, and it's supposed to be a
yeah.
rom-com, and I was
Uh-huh.
like, and then the conversation with the parents are like, oh, we looked at his porn industry. We know he's not gay. And I'm like, that's
Right.
inciting to a
The
child that would be overhearing
normalization
it's
of their
gay.
19-year-old boy. Right. And
We
so
need
that
him
is
to be more of a creep. Come
the
work for us.
degradation of society, that it is normal and expected, not even just normal, but expected that teenage boys are consuming porn. In what society did we expect our teens to be watching naked people engaging in intercourse with each other? Like, what has happened in our society that that's become normal, and how do we get back to what's actually normal?
Well, and on the topic of that movie, Colton and I were talking about it. I'm like, this is the kid that I would want my daughter to date. He's nerdy. He likes anime. He's not interested in wanting to
Right.
defile a woman or look at her in a lustful way. And his parents are out to make him a womanizer. And
Mhm.
it just like, it crushed me because it was the
Uh-huh.
rom-com you should have watched, the one that should make you feel good. And I think I'm a little more passionate about that soapbox because, like, I sold my soul to the devil because I was like, oh, Twilight, they lived eternally. Satan, come give me eternal life. And so I went and sought out spells because of
Yeah.
little subliminal things that thoughts led to. And so, sorry, I went down that. But
No, but
with
real. That's real.
it is, and it's which I think has made me want to produce content for that, is like I want to go
Mhm.
back to wholesome things that don't incite things that are going to like lead you, because I think
Right.
you haven't mentioned it this time, but pornography eventually leads to pedophilia because the girls do
Mhm.
get younger and younger, and I
Mhm.
feel like the younger that you start out, it's harder to want to look at an older woman, so that taste just remains the same.
Right.
And
Our brains are sensitized to particular things. And if you're unable to climax anymore with this, then you're just going to tweak it a little bit and tweak it a little. Again, like, nobody sets out, very few people set out to become pedophiles.
yeah,
Very few people are like, wow, I really desire to be attracted to children. It
yeah,
is something that happens over time as repeated exposure desensitizes what your sexual appetite is over time.
no,
It
I
degrades.
believe it. It's,
Yeah.
I think you guys talked about in your talk, didn't you show brain scans or how it's similar to an
Mhm,
addict or cocaine and
mhm,
heroin? It does the same thing to your brain
mhm.
as far as side by side.
Yep.
So if somebody's watching this or they're hearing about this and they're like, no, I have a problem and they need
Mhm.
help, what resources have you and Craig stumbled upon that you have seen actually help if somebody's like, I want help, but I'm not ready to
Mhm.
walk into a church? Where can they go?
Yeah. There are so many resources, actually. A first person that I would encourage them to start following online and get resources from would be Joshua Broome.
Okay.
Um, he is someone that Craig and I were fortunate enough to become friends with just through internet influencer, whatever. Such a weird thing to
Online
even,
stuff.
yeah, like, such a weird thing to even say. But he was like the top porn star in America, making $1 million, um, and became suicidal, wanted to die, and was radically saved through an encounter with the Lord, and is now a pastor. And so, of course, he's very passionate about helping men out of pornography addictions and out of the sex industry. And so, even on his Instagram, there's just so many different resources
Okay.
And a lot of it has to do with accountability. A lot of people are going back to flip phones, and they're downloading certain apps that will mirror to your accountability partner. And so I'm like, I know even Craig acts as an accountability partner for multiple men, that he
Wow.
can see what they're seeing on their phone, and he'll get an alert if there's anything that is remotely, sketchy. But the thing that I know about pornography addictions is you cannot and you should not try to do it alone on your own
Yeah.
willpower, because willpower is pretty weak and it fails, and we need community when it comes to addiction. And when it comes to pornography addiction, you need other people around you to help. And there's just so many resources now that if you want to get help and you're ready to seek help, help's there for you.
I so value that. Like, when I first became a Christian, I was so humbled and I was like, yeah, I used to be in the porn industry. I
Mhm.
had no idea until I went to a revive night and I heard a woman, she had given this whole speech and she's like, yeah, like dealing with my husband cheating on me. And I'm like, oh man, she must have like walked in on some hard trauma. And she's like, he looked at porn. And I was like, that's it. Like we encourage that, don't we? Or like it was so, and I don't want to diminish her or say it, but
Right.
that was the first time that someone didn't block the fact that 80% of men and 60% of women struggle with
Right.
pornography.
Right.
And then I was like, oh, I'm the villain walking into these situations. It was because I was just like, God delivered for me this, and my grandma was a prostitute, and blah blah blah, and
Oh.
not, but
Oh, I was so naive growing up. I remember breaking up with a boyfriend that I really cared about because I had found out that he had watched porn, and I thought that he was an absolute monster.
where I was
And
on
then
the opposite.
I remember my own mother being like, "Did I do you a disservice by not, like, teaching you about certain things?" And she was the one who was like, "This is actually a really common struggle. He's not a monster." And that led me down this, like, path of learning that Christian or non-Christian, church or not church, that the statistics for pornography consumption are crazy high.
Yeah. And that I really value that there's conversation starting to happen is yes, it's a shame thing, but there's no shame in getting help. Like it's better to get help than to hide and have it
Right.
progress and
Mhm.
eventually lead to yours or somebody else's detriment. Hey guys, I just wanted to pop on here real quick and say thank you guys so much for watching. We don't have a sponsor, but we do have a message for you. If you are somebody that is a Christian, that is a Christ follower, that shares our mission and our values, and if you are somebody or you know somebody that has a testimony that is worth sharing, but they're not somebody that is super tech savvy or they just don't have the means to go about it, but they know that they have a message and that God has done something cool in their life and they share the same values as the team here at Curios, please, please, please message us. We would love to get with you and to hear your story. And you can contact us via email or click any of the links that are attached. And if you are enjoying our content and would like to hear more testimonies, we've got a lot of good ones in store for you. So make sure to hit that subscribe button and that like button and share with a friend if you think it might impact them. What advice do you have for the women that aren't ready to admit that this is the wrong thing for them, but are on that line? Like I'm on the balance of I want to be done with this, but I don't know if I'm ready. I know you
Mhm.
mentioned like asking some of those really life questions, but
Mhm.
what is some other advice you would have for say an OnlyFans worker who's like, no other guys touching my stuff. I'm just showing pictures. It's not that big of
Mhm.
a deal.
Honestly, a lot of times I get really sciencey about it with
Okay.
those particular women. Like, okay, well, you're not, if you're a believer, of course, we're gonna go with this is morally wrong. Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
God, they don't approve of this. Let's not do this. You're not gonna be blessed in the kingdom. For someone who's not a believer, I'm going to get very sciencey about it. And we're going to talk about how this will affect their sexuality for generation and how
Okay.
it will be harder for them to experience sexual pleasure. And this is women who aren't getting touched. This is women who are just putting their bodies on display. But I would talk about a lot of the things that it's doing to your brain, a lot of the areas that it's desensitizing, and how it's going to affect your relationship.
Mm,
Um, 'Cause it's easy when you're like, "Well, you're gonna get STDs." Like that, sure.
Yeah.
or you're going to get pregnant, or, but when it comes to OnlyFans, it's a little bit different because a lot of times women won't even show their face. And so they feel like it's harmless because they're just showing their body.
Yeah.
But also talking about how you're contributing to the downfall of society by, again, desensitizing the people who are consuming your physical body. What are you doing in their brains that's going to lead to the harm of another? How are you contributing to sex trafficking? How are you contributing to civilization and society as a whole being sick? Sometimes appealing that way, and other times just pleading with, there's better for you.
Yeah, I like that. So education, you would say, is probably one of the most crucial things to going to battle in the porn industry. Is there anything else that you've seen from your stance, which I think is a very strong authority of both medical and spiritual, that could be used to address that in general?
So in the sex industry, one thing that I've heard a lot is that they're like, well, I'm doing it safely. I'm not at risk for pregnancy. I'm on birth control. I'm not at risk for STDs because everyone that I sleep with is clean. And so, like, one thing that I learned is in the porn industry is that you do have to provide your papers. Like, hey, here's my papers. I don't have HIV. I don't have chlamydia, gonorrhea, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But the thing is that you can only test for certain bacterial STDs. We are not routinely testing men for HPV, the human papillomavirus, and you don't really find out about it until it shows up on a woman's pap smear, and that's what causes cervical cancer. What's happening is these women who think that they're not getting exposed, they're getting exposed to plenty.
Okay.
So it's the same thing with herpes, is that really the best way to diagnose the herpes virus is to culture it off of an actual lesion on the genitals and say, okay, yes, this is what this is. Because we make what's called IgG in the blood, and you can test it and you can get a positive, but just because you have a positive doesn't mean you know exactly where it came from.
Yeah.
So like you can have HSV2 on the lips here and not have it genitally. And so it's not like a reliable way to test for STDs through blood work. You can say, oh yeah, you've been exposed, you have IgG, but there's just so many pitfalls and so many imperfections when it comes to testing for STDs that A, you sometimes can't even test for it, or B, it's not a reliable method of testing. Like, yeah, you're probably not going to get HIV or chlamydia because those are easily tested for, but you're going to be exposed to all sorts of other things and different bacteria and microbiomes over and over and over. Struggle with recurrent bacterial vaginosis, or BV. It's a big thing that sex workers struggle with, is chronic BV.
And the medication will kill your kidneys, won't it, if you're always on it?
Well, it's just antibiotics in general. You're getting rid of one bacteria and also getting rid of another bacteria. It's hard on your liver or kidneys, depending on what you're on. And it just comes right back. And so when you're messing with the human microbiome by introducing so many men's bacteria and semen, there are devastating consequences beyond just having HIV or an STD. And so I would talk about that. I would talk about the repercussions of inability to orgasm and experience pleasure in a regular relationship with repeated sexual events, or even with just viewing pornography.
Yeah.
I think I talked about this too, that the phenomenon of, I know, he's
cute. No, I'm like, I wanted to take a picture. I was like, just chilling.
I told my kids to keep the dogs upstairs, but it did not happen. But we're talking about like literal ED in pornography workers. And so a lot of men are actually taking Viagra and Cialis and certain things because they can no longer become erect normally. And so for women, of course, it's a little bit different because it's not as visible with an erection, but it becomes very, very, very hard to orgasm normally, and you lose sensitivity because, again, you're desensitized to certain hardcore things, or it becomes so normal that it's no longer arousing for you. And so
I can speak to that.
Yeah, it is so real. It's so real.
It is. There's, I mean, almost 10 years later, so like a
Mhm.
little bit of a story, but when we were closing the arcade in Coeur d'Alene, somebody that I didn't even have sex with, I just did
Mhm.
oral performance for when I was
Mhm.
13 or 14. He
Oh,
walked into the arcade and I stopped in my tracks and I had to go upstairs because I had a panic attack, which is
mhm.
not common for me. Like I was hyperventilating, like I had just
Yeah.
walked in on somebody that gang raped me. Like it was like uncontrollable. And I was like, I was consensual in that. But then I had to think from an adult brain as I was a little girl.
Is a
I was
13-year-old truly consensual
right.
with a very
But I was
undeveloped frontal
so
cortex?
convinced. Well, and I was so convinced because socially it was normal and it was acceptable.
Sure.
And it was just like, and even going through a lot of the other stuff that I went through when I was doing the camming, which the company that created OnlyFans was the one I worked for.
Mhm.
I looked like a child. So I'm like, the people that were sending me money, like it wasn't, yes, I was of age, but it was because I looked like a child, which killed me even more. And then
Yeah.
in my relationship with my husband, who was faithful and waited, he was wanted to enjoy those moments. There was a lot of firsts that he missed out on because I had
Yeah.
already done it, or I would have flashbulb memories and have trauma and just start crying. And because I'm now at this point of actually being loved and whole, and my poor husband who waited 26 years is seeing the brunt of it. And so like I think that that's something that's not talked about is
Mhm.
even when you're out of it and you're in the point of redemption and the new creation of Christ, like the enemy will attack you and he's going to attack you with things that you
Yeah.
thought you were consensual
There's
with.
there's
And
still consequences to sin. Even when we are a newer creation, there are still things that need to be undone
and
and
it's
healed.
It's amazing. Like, if I could go back and tell every little girl, I'm like, honor your purity. I don't care how your mom dresses. I don't care what TV says. Like, that is a gift to you. That is a gift to your spouse. Like, honor it, please. So I think it's cool, by the way, that you guys got to be virgins together.
Yeah, I mean, like, I would say by the hair of my chinny chin chin.
But you did it. So there's
Yeah.
that. Um,
Ish.
it
But
was when I
yeah,
first got saved, God surrounded me by virgins. And I was like, I like all of you guys. Why didn't I like do this? So it's,
but now, like, part of your story that you get to speak to that, these are things that are not easy to speak about for a lot of women, and the world really needs women like us who are comfortable putting ourselves on the front line and talking about the real consequences to sexual impurity, how it really affects you mind, body, and spirit, and how there are consequences for believers and non-believers alike.
And it's amazing the consequences, but yeah, like whether you are a Christian or not, like the consequences are things you wouldn't expect in ways that you wouldn't expect. Well,
I
I
just,
mean,
like,
well,
remember so many women just absolutely and young women, 13, 14, 15, absolutely sobbing because they'd, contracted genital herpes, and
yeah,
there's of course, there's that, especially with younger women, the "it won't happen to me" phenomenon is really real when the brain isn't fully developed, and, um,
the coach told
like,
me.
yeah, talking to so many teens that I'm like, "Hey, well, we need to test you for chlamydia," and they're like, "Ew, that's disgusting," and I'm like, "That's
But we
ironic
need to.
because there's a 25% chance you have it right now." Like, those kind of, like, that would never happen to me, that's so disgusting, and me being like, "It takes one time, one touch for you to have genital herpes, which you cannot treat, and it will be with you forever for the rest of your life," and telling
You
a
can't even.
13-year-old that, and
Yeah.
having them sobbing and sobbing. I'm like, those are things that we have to talk about, not to bring shame, of course, for people who are already dealing with it, but to bring awareness and to remind women that it's not normal to have sex before marriage. And it's not normal to engage in promiscuity. And there are consequences, and they actually are devastating.
It is. Well, and like I had a friend who, when she was around the same age as me when we were teenagers, and she got warts, and it was like
Mhm.
she couldn't give a vaginal birth, like
Oh,
all sorts of stuff. She's
right.
still
So
struggling
common.
with relationships, and
Mhm.
I love her to death, but it could have been me. So I'm like, I'm not pointing
Right.
fingers, but it
Right.
is. I read a case study in The Power of Habit. The infant mortality rate was like high, like there was tons of infant deaths. And so this guy went and did a study, and he found out that the increase in infant deaths was a lack of education and nutrition. So moms were poorly feeding themselves, but they were also poorly feeding their kids, and not because they wanted to, but because there was a lack of education. And once they implemented nutrition in schools and in those areas, it was a 90% increase of life.
Yeah.
And so that study like always reminds me of, let's have the conversation, because that's a 90% chance, but it's not necessarily in that case.
Well, and the Bible verse that says, my people perish for lack of knowledge. And like sometimes it is a lack of knowledge. And like sex ed is just not enough. Like we got to go into way more than just that. And I'm sure sex ed is just convoluted in the public. I can't even fathom what.
The trending movies on Netflix right now make it all casual.
Yeah, I watched that. I started that movie too, and I was absolutely just like,
we had to stop it.
Like, same thing. She was on the beach and got out of the waves, and I was like, well, she is top and bottom naked, and like, what? I'm like, how is this on Netflix? It's like the #1 movie or whatever, like the top 10.
We're watching Marco Polo right now, and there's some scenes that are like 4 minutes drawn out, and it's the height of a political climax. So it's like, in order to know the plot, it's like, but like if you struggled with porn addiction, like I just triggered you and you just relapsed, and you're watching a show about a Christian man who gets sold into the Mongolian Empire, and I'm like, what? So it's in the world, but I do thank you for providing resources. And I have a feeling that you may be talking on this topic a little bit more.
Absolutely. That is what I plan to launch into.
So how can people find you?
Right now I'm just on Instagram. I'm sure I'll probably start a TikTok soon. But I'll probably do, some sort of podcast, some sort of online community, more things to come, but mostly just on Instagram. A Jessica Brown.
A Jessica Brown.
Not B, just A.
Nice. And is there anything else that you want to add before I ask you your closing question of your favorite Bible verse / book of the Bible?
I would add that if you're watching this and there's anything that Kirsty or I have talked about, whether it be mental illness, childhood trauma, OCD, anxiety, whatever, or you're struggling in some sort of sexual addiction, or you want to change the way that you're approaching your sexuality, I would say reach out, get help, phone a friend. If you're not a church person, phone a friend. Get resources, and you can still reach out to us church people, and we will love you just the same.
Amen. That's really good. All right. So in closing, what is your favorite Bible verse / book of the Bible?
I know it probably is a little cliche, but Esther's, of course, my favorite book of the Bible.
Really?
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about someone who became a queen and just embodied femininity, and how God used, I think what I love about it is that God used her femininity to save a nation of people. And I love that. I'm a girly girl, and I just read a book that is talking about like restoring biblical femininity. And I was just thinking about like in Esther, I'm like, she like won these hearts over. She created a banquet. She presented her tact and her beauty and the things that God gives us as women. And through that did something crazy powerful. I just love it.
That's amazing.
Well,
So coming from your background, do you know what her 12 months of beauty treatments were? Like,
I don't know, but there was a lot of oils and a lot of bathing and a lot of hair treatments, and I don't really know the particulars, but I know 1 year though. I'm like, what can you do in a year of spa treatments?
So I heard it was to sterilize her so that she couldn't have babies, but I don't know And so I've been
Oh.
fascinating because that would make sense if they had access to that. Because I know Egyptians, I learned this
Mhm.
from Assassin's Creed while my husband was playing it, but they would tie hair over their neck, like a string of hair. And if their thyroid expanded, that was a sign of pregnancy and the hair would snap. So they knew if they were pregnant based on the hair snapping. Yeah, fun fact, Assassin's
Oh
Creed
my
makes
gosh.
everything historically accurate. And so they have all of these quotes. But I found that out. And then there was someone else that was talking about. So
Mhm.
I'm like, if Egyptians knew how to tell you were pregnant based on the thyroid expansion,
Mhm.
snapping a hair, did Esther go through sterilization? Like, I don't know enough
Oh,
about it. And I've heard
honestly,
some history.
I've never heard that. Doesn't mean that
Nope.
it's not true,
If you do
but
research, you should make content about it because I want
yeah.
to know.
Oh my gosh, I'm definitely gonna read into that 'cause I love the Book of Esther, and we were just talking about that. We're like, 12 months of beauty treatments? Like,
What was
what
that?
what possibly
How
like
dirty was she?
right, like, what possibly could take 12 full months to beautify a woman? But yeah, that'll be interesting. I'm gonna look into that.
Right.
Um, ooh, my favorite verse, Numbers 24. May the Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you. Life verse, we have it hanging all over our house. I I just think it's one of those, like, just departing verses. Like, "May
Mm.
the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you." That first part is just like there's nothing, like, particular that you're getting or giving, but having the Lord's face shine upon you and bless you and keep you, that's everything.
Yeah, that's a perfect ending. Thank you so much for that, and amen. And
Amen.
thank you. Thank you. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and that little bell so you can get notifications and not miss a single episode of what we have in store for season 1. I promise it is a lot of good stuff. Every episode is jam-packed full of authentic stories and wisdom that you can relate with. And we'll see you next time.